So it's great to have you here, Nicholas. Um, Thanks for taking the time to meet with us and let us know a bit more about ARCA1. Maybe we can start by you introducing yourself and telling everyone about the kind of work you do.
Good. So thank you very much for inviting me. Really, it's a privilege to be part of this community because my involvement in ataxias go back, I think, in my first years of residency when I was studying neurology. So it goes a long way back, and also my involvement in genetics goes back to college. I think that's what got me interested into medicine and now. All the therapeutic aspects. So it's come a long way, and really it's always good to feel that there are a lot of living communities around. So that's, it's in these times of confinement, and I know my patients are respecting the rules extremely well. So I'm always wondering, how they can cope with the loneliness and so that's anyway. I want to have a thought for my patients and for all the people here watching this tonight that it's you can still be part of a community if you're not necessarily going to attending your clinics as usual, and so it's always special events when these happen. So I'm a professor of medicine at the Faculty of Medicine at Laval University. I've been there for almost 20 years now, and so I'm a full professor there. And my laboratory activities are mainly around neurodegenerative diseases that are sometimes inherited, sometimes not. So I've been publishing over the years on Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's disease, and of course ataxias. And my involvement with this type of ataxia is that I was part of the team as a young scientist who discovered the gene and who described the disease initially because it was more common at the time in Quebec than it was known elsewhere. So that's why it was easier for us to map the disease in Quebec than it would have been in a very diverse population across Canada or in the US or even in Europe. And I would say that my involvement on the clinical side is that I'm running the neurogenetics clinic at the CHU de Québec, Université Laval, which is the largest academic hospital in Eastern Quebec, and it's one of the largest academic hospitals in Quebec. So we collaborate with a variety of groups in Europe, sometimes in Japan, Taiwan, the United States, and across Canada to Brazil, North Africa, wherever we can encounter other communities of people who suffer from rare diseases like the rare ataxias. So that summarizes my involvement, I would say, overall.
Okay. Actually, it's good. Today we have quite a few people with ARCA1. Does everyone with ARCA1 want to raise your hands? Amy doesn't have ARCA1. She's just saying hi. But we have like four or five people, which is pretty good. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the origin of ARCA1. Like, how did you come across it? And does just because you discovered it in Quebec, does that mean it originated in Quebec, or what can you tell us?
So the genetic diseases, they always come with a story in terms of, and a story often that goes with populations that move from one place to another. There is always a first mutation somewhere, so we don't know exactly where it happened, but it happened somewhere, before the first French-Canadian founders established themselves in the 1700s, on the south shore of Quebec City. So they probably acquired that mutation in Europe somewhere, hundreds or even thousands of years before. And before when people start gathering together and and they marry people that live close by, even if they're not direct cousins. You know, there's always a what we call a population isolate. So it means people who descend from the same few founders. And obviously, south from Quebec, you had people speaking French. They were Catholics, so they did not intermarry a lot with people from other linguistic groups or religions, or even with the native population. And so, after a few hundred years, you start seeing recessive diseases more in these areas. And so these phenomena are not really only seen in Quebec. You see that in the fjords in Scandinavia. You see it in many subpopulations in the United States. For example, if you people from Ashkenazi Jewish origins, people from some groups, different parts of Italy, groups from India sometimes who intermarry. And so you tend to have this in either cultural or geographic isolates. So in Quebec, there are a few diseases like the Charlevoix Ataxia, and in Quebec, actually, ARCA1, we call it the Beauce Ataxia, which is B-A-U-C-E, because it comes from the Beauce area south from Quebec City, which has nothing to do with the Beauce area in France. But you can imagine that they picked the toponyms that they had in France, and they just, you know, reused the same ones in Quebec. So we have often we name the ataxias in Quebec according to their area or the regions where people go, so or people are from. So this the first families were described by my mentor from Quebec City. His name is Jean-Pierre Bouchard, and he's the one who described RSACs. So as a young student, he said, well, you should see a few of these patients. I think they look like one another. So we did a genetic study where we sampled patients, and we looked at we looked at their genes and localized the on which part of the genome the mutation was, and eventually identified mutations. And I would say that we were expecting to find one mutation that would explain all the cases from Quebec, but we found one main mutation, but a total of 7 mutations. And now we are with dozens, if not hundreds, of different mutations that have been described around the world. And, you know, some patients are related to the initial cases that we found in Quebec, but very few outside from Quebec have these known mutations. Some in the United States, you know, a lot of people from Quebec moved to the United States in the 1800s. So there are some scattered French Canadians there in the northeastern United States. But apart from that, if you have a case from, let's say, from France, from Germany, from Holland, from even I was reviewing a paper recently from China, even another paper, Saudi Arabia. So it's become kind of a worldwide phenomena, and it's not restricted to the mutations that come from Quebec. Many other mutations have occurred, and so it's always a challenge to map it, but now we have a lot of bioinformatics tools and a lot of collaborative groups. And I would say that there are probably about 10 groups around the world that publish regularly on ARCA1. Sometimes it's the imaging studies, sometimes it's the more basic science aspects, and sometimes it's more studying the clinical aspects. So it's a small community, but still very widespread around the world.
So you mentioned that there's a gene mutation on my paperwork. It indicates that there's a mutation with this a gene or protein, whatever, called SYNE1.
Yes.
Is that typical of most ataxias, or is that
so
ARCA1? Sorry.
Yes, there is I have a very, very smart student who did a review on all the known ataxias that are recessive. Recessive means that you need one parent to give you, that your parents are not affected, but that they each have given you one bad copy of the gene. And so there was, every time they had children, there was a 25% chance that he would get ARCA1 as a child with ARCA1. So a recessive disease so ARCA1 is a recessive. That's why we say AR, autosomal recessive. And so the mutations that are found in these, and so there are really now close to 60 different recessive ataxia. So the most common one is the Friedreich ataxia. RSAX is also a very common one, and ARCA1 is among the most frequent as well. So it's in the top 3 or 4 recessive ataxias. So really there is a wide range of different ataxias that exist. Some are more severe, some less severe, some affect the nerves, some don't affect the nerves. Some produce funny eye movements, some don't necessarily. So it's a very wide spectrum of diseases that are described among the recessive ataxias, of which ARCA1 is part.
Right. Going back to your previous to the previous question, how rare or prevalent is ARCA1? Like, how many people would you say roughly have it in Canada, US, or across the world?
Yeah, so in Quebec, obviously, because of the founder effect, we have maybe 150 people who have it. So it's quite a common ataxia in Quebec. If you go across the United States, I would say, I mean, around the world, it certainly ranges in the thousands of cases, I would assume, but nobody has the exact figure. There are, in Europe, there are hundreds spread across Europe. In North America, I would say as well, hundreds, if not thousands of patients that may have it. So it's sometimes when it starts late, and when there's no family history, the people will not, I mean, more and more now, because the genetic tests are quite cheap and quite reliable. But some years ago, I suspect that many patients did not necessarily get a diagnosis because it started a bit late. They had no family history, and so they may have been seen by a neurologist a few times, and the diagnosis was maybe not clear, or so. So I suspect there are still a lot of cases around the world that have not been diagnosed, especially if they haven't been to a specialty clinic or a subspecialty clinic.
What is I know there's an ARCA2, but I've never actually met anyone with it. What is the difference between ARCA1 and ARCA2?
The nomenclature of ataxias is very confusing, and so there is not much in common between ARCA1, 2, and 3, and 4, and really they're very different diseases. So we tend to avoid, right now, there is a nomenclature that was proposed by the movement disorder societies that talks about the using just the gene name. So it would be like autosomal recessive ataxia / sign 1 with the name of the gene, which is more resilient. But when you start teaching your students and you tell them, well, this is a sign 1, this is a this is a that, often the gene names are very complicated.
Right.
So in Quebec, I speak, when I refer to the cases, I speak about the Beauce ataxia. Among my colleagues, we speak about ARCA1 because it's the name that was given, but it's kind of an imperfect. In the literature, people often refer it as well to sign 1 related ataxia. So and really the ARCA 1, 2, 3, 4, they don't have much in common.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is first time I'm hearing about 3 and 4. I only knew about 1 and 2. How many are there?
Oh, well, I think it should stop at 4 probably, because after that the people are kind of there's already a SCAR nomenclature for recessive ataxias. We added when we described ARCA1, we added ARCA, and then there's the MDS nomenclature, there's the sign one. So really it's kind of confusing, this nomenclature. Our students, you know, they're they want to stay away sometimes from ataxias because the names are too complicated.
Right. Normally with ARCA1, what is the progression like? Like, do people end up in a wheelchair, or how does
Yeah,
it
it's
work?
very variable. I would say that some of my patients have started, you know, around 15 or 20 years old with their symptoms, and obviously they get more disabled as they get around 40 or 50. Some other patients have had started in their 30s, so they keep their ambulation much longer. One aspect that's important is that, contrary to many other ataxias, there is no peripheral nerve disease in ARCA, and there's no real and patients do not have that much spasticity, meaning stiff limbs. So if your limbs are not stiff and you're not too weak of your feet and you can feel your feet well, usually the patients, if they're in shape, they can keep their and they, you know, if they're not too sedentary or don't have other medical conditions, they can remain, you know, they can keep walking for decades. So really, I wouldn't say that all the ARCA1 patients that I've seen have ended up, you know, in a wheelchair necessarily. And so, you know, if people have an exercise program and they keep healthy, I think they can hope to keep their ambulation for a long time. So I think that's, you know, compared to other ataxias, it's much less severe, for example, than
Yeah,
acute ataxia.
I've noticed that too, that especially with like Friedrich's ataxia,
Hmm.
some of the cases can be pretty severe.
Oh
And
yeah.
I don't notice that in myself necessarily.
No, I find that the part of the disability that I see in my patients, there's the disability that goes unnoticed, like for
Yeah,
example, all the
like in
cognitive
the head
syndrome.
maybe, like, yeah.
Yes, the what we call the cognitive syndrome, that my friend and colleague, Dr. Schmaman, has described this, and we also described it a while ago in a paper in the Cerebellum, the journal, the Cerebellum. It's often the multitasking. I've had several parents who were having trouble doing all the same thing, you know, coming back from work and taking care of the kids and the kids shouting and trying to cook, and, you know, things that you expect people in their 20s and 30s will do will do fine with. For them, it's more difficult. So that's one of the subtleties I've seen in trying to plan and organize your life. So you don't get a dementia, you get a kind of a planning difficulty, and that's subtle. It's hard to explain to to your peers, to even you know, your spouse or employer, or even I've had people who underwent some legal issues, you know, with in a divorce case, for example, where your ability to take care of your children, and so these are the kind of subtle things that I think they affect patients a lot, but sometimes they go unnoticed if you don't know the disease well enough.
Right. And I suspect the answer is probably similar to the last question, but does ARCA1 affect or have any impact on lifespan?
Lifespan, that's a good question. So there's no real good data for lifespan on these patients. I mean, it does not affect heart or lung function. Most degenerative diseases affect lifespan somewhat. But I would say that, you know, I would see, you know, there are some patients in their 60s that, you know, that are, you know, they have disability, but, you know, in terms of the rest of their function, Friedreich, eventually, if it affects your heart, if it gives you a scoliosis, a lot of these more severe recessive ataxias have other disabilities than the cerebellar impact. So I would say that, again, in terms of keeping ambulation, staying away for decades from the wheelchair, even having a life expectancy which may be a little bit less than the average in your area, but still, it's not shortened like in most ataxias, where certainly 10 or 15 years or 20 years less you can have in some, like in Friedrich, for example, or.
Okay. In what manner does ARCA1, all, correct me if I'm wrong, but all ataxias affect the cerebellum, right?
Yes, mostly. Some definitely more than others. In Friedrich, because you have a lot of effects on the nerve and the spinal cord, and sometimes it hides a little bit the cerebellum, the cerebellar impact. So probably ARCA1 is a bit more cerebellar than Friedreich, but because it doesn't have the other impacts, then it's less severe. So you can, the cerebellum is an important organ, but you can compensate a little bit more for disability of the cerebellum with the rest of your brain. Contrary to, if you lose your nerve, you lose your nerve. If you lose your motor neurons, you lose your motor neurons. It's hard to compensate, but the cerebellum, you can, kind of use a little bit other functions and other tracks to mitigate the impact.
And I've read that sometimes when it comes to the brain, if there's a certain part in a weakened state, another part of the brain can take over some
Yes.
things. Right?
Yes, that's very true. Even, yeah, definitely one part of the cerebellum may be compensated by some parts of the thalamus, some parts of the basal ganglia. Sometimes it's some of the brainstem nuclei. So it's, yes, there is I mean, usually the brain does that for most disabilities.
Right.
And it's true for the cerebellum. It's true for other disabilities as well.
Yeah. Okay. And how, like, in what manner does it affect the cerebellum, or in what manner does it affect the function of the cerebellum?
So I have to shorten the anatomy lesson for this, but for the brain has thousands and thousands of different subtypes of neurons, and so we probably don't know right now, how many really there are in terms of subtypes, and could be in the hundreds of thousands. I'm blanking on a number, but there is one type of cerebellar. There was one type of neuron that is only in the cerebellum. It's called the Purkinje cell. It's a huge neuron, very, very big. Its nucleus is really big, and this is one you remember as a medical student because it's so large and it looks like branches of a tree. So really this, and these neurons, they need a lot of structural protein. And so like sign 1 is a bit like a scaffolding protein, and we believe it's helping the Purkinje cell to maintain its very large superstructure. So, you can take maybe of the Purkinje cell as a big bridge or something, and you need some columns or scaffoldings to be able to so it holds properly. And if you don't get the right scaffolding, then whoops, you may start losing it as you age. And so that's one way to see it.
Okay. Now, previously you mentioned that ARCA1 is a bit more, maybe it affects cognitive abilities a bit more. And I'm wondering a few things. If, like, for myself, I know, does it affect like the emotions or behavior?
Probably. So this we have not studied because our study was not neuropsychology or neuropsychiatric or behavioral. So we did not look at the way people interacted with others, but we looked at the way they were able to solve different problems. And they are able to solve the problems, but it takes more time. And sometimes their strategies are not the ones that people will normally use. So it takes a while, and it's not sometimes the best strategy, but eventually they get the answer. In terms of changing their personality, well, this is hard because every time, every person who has a neurodegenerative disease will face some issues. There is always a higher rate of depression, of anxiety, so these are kind of hard to. Is there an additional component to the cerebellum? I'm not sure. The cerebellum is certainly cognitive, but I'm not sure it's neuropsychiatric. Right. But maybe my colleague, Dr. Schmaman, would have some thoughts about this. We may look at the cerebellum as a more psychiatric organ than I do, but I tend to stick to the cognitive until there's more evidence on the psychiatric aspects.
Well, this brings up another good point. Typically, when we look online and just look for definitions of what does the cerebellum do, right? It's typically down to motor control, balance, coordination, physical stuff, right? But I know myself and other people I've talked to experience more of the cognitive and emotional stuff. What is the possibility that the function of the cerebellum isn't fully understood?
Yeah, it's interesting. Often when I start my lectures, I talk about ataxia, and people, when they think about ataxia, they always think about the gait. People tend to fall, and so that's the first thing you learn, and people stick to that. But really, ataxia means it means disorder. It means, so often I give them an example. I said, when my kids, I entered in the room and it's all messy, it's ataxic. So the Greek word refers to disorder. So lack of order of movement, and lack of order of your thoughts may be one way to see it. You have troubles synchronizing your thoughts with one another, and synchronizing the different tasks that you do. So,
well, it's a form of uncoordination, right?
Yes, I would say uncoordination, asynchrony, and that really goes to the concept of ataxia as even in the Greek root of the word.
Okay. Are there any more research projects underway or planned regarding ARCA1?
So there's always some basic science project. The difficulty in basic sciences with ARCA1 is sign one. The gene is very, very big. So trying to correct a gene like this, even to insert it in animal models or cell model, is very difficult. So that's been a major limiting step in understanding the neurobiology of ARCA1, because it's a very complex gene to investigate, and so that's being and also eventually there are emerging therapies in the ataxias right now, but they are more right now directed at the expansion repeat diseases, like when you look at the ataxias, you have the recessive ataxias, you have the dominant ataxias, and the dominant ataxias, people refer to them as the SCAs or the SCAs. So the SCAs usually are caused by an expansion of the genome. And so it's easier to target for pharmaceutical. So right now, most of the promising therapies that I would say will come out over the next few years, or at least in clinical trials, they will be in the SCAs. And after that, correcting a point mutation or 2-point mutations, that's harder. And so that will take more time, I think. So if we have success, let's say within 5 years in the SCAs, then it's, we should see some of the same technology being used for the recessive ataxias, but it's a big challenge right now.
Right. Um, and what it I the studies I've seen are about ARCA1 are primarily coming out of Quebec and McGill and I guess Laval and stuff like that. Is are there any? Is there anyone else doing studies around the world? Do you
Yes,
know?
there is a group in Germany, for example, in Tübingen, a very nice university city in the Black Forest. So they near, I would say, south of Frankfurt, near the French border. So they have a large group there. There's also a group in Paris that's been looking at mutations, and so there are some Brazilians interested as well. The so there's a group in the UK that contacted me about a year ago because they wanted some samples of patients, and so there are a number of groups, but I wouldn't say, there are not dozens of groups. There may be a dozen groups that investigate the clinical and basic science aspects.
Right. Um, Now, what is the best way for people to read more about ARCA1?
The one very reliable resource that can be used by patients or clinicians alike is the gene test or genereviews.org. So if you go on the genereview.org website and you type in sign one, there is a very, very good summary there of all the basic information. So if you type Google sign one and then you type gene review, it comes up in the first post, and then you see a very, very reliable source of information for therapies and for the what's known of the disease. And you can even give it to your physician if he's not familiar with the condition, your GP, or even if your neurologist hasn't seen many cases, and so that's a very reliable source.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned that as far as a cure goes, you'd have to, the way you see it is that something you're thinking that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, if they find something about SCA, it'll make the job of finding a cure easier for ARCA1 or other recessives.
Yes, we need a few success stories in the ataxias to make people confident about investing in the basic science and putting all these new drugs on the market. So once we have a few success stories, and I think they will come mostly from the SCAs, they could come from Friedreich as well, but it's a more complex disease to treat, Friedreich. I'm more confident about the SCAs myself. So if we see a few drugs on the market within, let's say, 5 years in the SCAs, I think that will drive confidence, and eventually we'll see some of the rarer and more difficult to approach ataxias getting some I would say positive feedback from this.
Right. And I noticed that most of the drug trials that are out there are typically for the SCAs or maybe FA. What is the likelihood that they're say someone with ARCA1 that maybe has more severe symptoms can use one of those drugs or can get a benefit from something like that?
So for the SCAs, they're going to be specific to one gene. So if you have SCA2 and the treatment is for SCA2, that's okay. If you have SCA1 or SCA5 or SCA7, it's not going to work. So they're specific to each gene. And there could be other drugs that are less specific. But these drugs, when they're less specific, usually they're less effective. So I'm not as confident. If it's a very general drug, that works for a lot of neurodegenerative diseases, it could work for many of them, but usually I'm less confident in these. Often the effects are quite minor.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for answering all my questions. I'm gonna ask Courtney to unmute everyone, and if everyone could kindly raise their hand, and we'll go ahead and let them ask their questions, or you can type it in the chat, and I can ask it. Before we get to that, Jesse asked the question about drug trials. I think we kind of covered that, but do you foresee anyone developing a drug trial for, say, ARCA1, or is it too?
So yes, I do, but again, it's a step-by-step process. So first step will be, I think, the SCAs. Then there could be targeted therapies, but it's a tough gene because of the size of the gene. So the new technologies like CRISPR, or you saw that there were two female scientists that won the Nobel Prize this week about the CRISPR technique. So it's very, very promising, very impressive work. But it often takes, a decade or even more sometimes before we can reliably construct therapies around a new technology like this. So I'm hopeful, but probably the ASOs will be more interesting. But could they be applicable to sign one? It's not clear at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Just raise your hand, or you can type. David, you want to go ahead? You have to unmute yourself, David. Oh, you're still muted. Maybe Diane, maybe you can. Oh,
I found
it. Okay. David, go ahead.
I was curious, in your studies of the brain, have you found with ataxia any other degenerative parts of the brain? Or is it ataxia specifically only working on the cerebellum, or does it work on other organs in the brain?
So for ARCA1, the most of the damage, I would say more than 90 or 95% is really strictly on the cerebellum. For the SCAs, it's much wider. It can be the whole brain, the brain stem, it can be the peripheral nerves. For Friedreich ataxia, a lot of the ascending system in the spinal cord is affected as well. So I would say for ARCA1, it's restricted to the cerebellum, but for other, especially the dominant ataxias, it's a much more widespread disease.
Do you know about episodic ataxia, perchance?
Yes, I follow a few patients with that. It's rare. Often it's kind of difficult to diagnose because some patients don't have necessarily the clear or very typical story. It's mixed up a lot with vestibular problems, so they may have seen ENT specialists for years. So and it can be, you may examine the patients and find some funny eye movements, sometimes a bit of ataxia, sometimes the exam is normal apart from the eye movements, and it's very rare. So I've suspected it much more than I've actually diagnosed it and confirmed it genetically.
Thank you.
Diane, do you want to ask your question?
Oh. Yes, please. I just was wondering whether or not eye movements, changes in eye movements was a common thing among, I know it is among a lot of ataxias, but in ARCA, for instance, I now have double vision. And it's,
so double vision.
I don't know whether or not there are other things.
So the visual problems
Yes.
Yes, they are very common in the ataxia. Sometimes patients have very persistent nystagmus. So the eye moves so quickly that they will find that they're a bit dizzy or so otherwise the eye movements can be subtle. Do they have an impact on everyday life? Well, they do because they slow down the speed at which you can correct your eye movements with your head with. So I would say, I mean, for example, if people are driving or there may be a bit of they have to be more careful if as they advance or because their capacity to integrate movement and maybe a little bit diminished. So yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Go ahead, Maria, and then Maggie after Maria. You have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I have a question. Nicholas, when you say that there's therapies or medication that obviously isn't there just yet, but when the cerebellum is shrunk,
Yes.
sorry, you're right. And you're giving a medication, how does that actually work? Like, if it's damaged already, like what is that going to do? Like, how does it work?
So let's take the example of the SCA2, which is probably the next disease that will have a very significant clinical trial. They will put the drug in the CSF, which means they will inject it in the lumbar spine to put it directly in the cerebrospinal fluid. So the drug will go directly to the cerebellum, and it will be able to block the expression of one bad copy of the gene which is toxic to the cell. It's not necessarily going to reverse the disease process, but it's going to slow it down. I don't know if it's going to stop it. We'll have to see because the biological impact of these, when you study them on mouse models, on cellular models, it's not the same as injecting them to patients. So I suspect that it's going to slow it down, but probably not stop it completely. If you were to do the same thing in ARCA1, it would be more complex because I'm not sure the ASOs will work. So you may have to use a technique like CRISPR, which sometimes can, effectively correct the sequence of the gene. And you would have to diagnose the disease early enough, that you don't get too much degeneration before you, because by the time we diagnose patients, often their cerebellum is very atrophied. So I suspect that you would have, these three, let's say we move forward in 20 years or when I'll be, hopefully I'll still be around and, seeing patients. Let's say we move forward. Ideally, you would like young people to have a genetic test early on for many, many different rare diseases. And so especially those that are treatable. And so you could see in advance, when a child grows, and see if he starts to have an impact on the cerebellum and then treat there, hopefully, and arrest the disease process earlier. So I think it's going to be a combination of prevention, early recognition, and then therapies and it may not necessarily bring back the function, not necessarily. So that's at least if it's slowing down, significantly, you can push, the disability further by 5 to 10 years. That would be a big achievement.
Thank you.
Maggie, do you want to ask your question?
Okay. Hi, Nicholas. Thank you. I've heard that ARCA1 is the slowest moving ataxia. and symptom-wise. Is this true, or is that wishful thinking?
It's one of the, I would say, there are severe ataxias, like the ARCA2, for example, is quite severe. There are some early onset Friedreich, a lot of them that are quite severe. So I would say that ARCA1 is probably in the moderate range, depending on when you start, because, if you start at 16-year-old, then it's more than moderate when you're 50, but if you start in your 30s, then it's maybe ataxias are never mild diseases. They're always moderate or severe. So I would say that ARCA1 is in the moderate spectrum of disease, but still, the impact is very significant, and we raised issues about cognition, and so.
I actually, what about like the symptoms progressing? Because I feel, but not as, fast as, I'm glad, thank God, but I do feel symptoms progressing a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, the ataxias usually, like ARCA1, the moderate ataxias, they progress, I would say in stages of 5 years to 5 years. So when I examine my patients, the imaging, I have not followed a lot of scans, but usually the cerebellum is quite atrophied early on, or it's quite shrunk early on. In terms of the clinical symptoms, every 5 years I see some differences in my patients, but it's year after year, often it's hard to see a difference. And often you have patients who, between 25-year-old and 35-year-old have been quite autonomous and independent and doing their stuff, and then whoops, at one point they have their energy diminishes and their ability to compensate from the symptoms diminishes, and they feel that suddenly, it's really, the symptoms have increased a lot. So sometimes, you compensate for disabilities, and then whoops, you lose a stage, and then it feels like suddenly the disease has gotten worse.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think I saw John Boyer, then Amy, then Jess.
Yes, I got a question. You said that SCAs are from a dominant gene from a parent, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Yes, so ARCA1 is a recessive disease, which means that the affected people have 2 bad copies, and they got 1 bad copy from their mother and 1 bad copy from their father. In the SCAs, they're dominant, so the father or the mother will give his bad copy. So only 1 parent has a bad copy, and when you have a bad copy, you have the disease. But the severity can vary. So in the SCAs, you can have a mild ataxia, you can have a severe ataxia, and a moderate ataxia in the same family. Whereas in ARCA1, it's a bit more homogeneous, the phenotype. So the people tend to look alike a little bit more. But in the scars, you can see a lot of differences because of the expansion repeat, we call when your gene, when you pass your gene from the parent to the child, then the gene can worsen. The impact of the gene can worsen. So and you can have a child which is a severe ataxia, and the parent who has a mild or moderate ataxia, but you don't see that in ARCA1.
Okay, one more question, please.
Sure.
I have 2 sisters who have probably a mild attack. I have severe attack. Now, is this common? This is what you're saying.
Yes, so every person has its, the brain is very redundant. So there are lots of neurons that can compensate for disabled neurons. But one's ability to do this and to fight the disease, because the disease, the brain is not passive. It's seeing that some of its functions are or lost, and so some other cells take over. So your ability to fight the degeneration of the Purkinje cells and your brain's ability to compensate for this will determine how much impact the disease has on you. And so and depending also if you have other medical conditions. So all these factors sometimes can make the disability vary for between 5 or 10 years between two people in the same family. So you could see these differences in ARCA1. In the scars, they can be even more dramatic. You can have a grandparent with very late onset symptoms in their 70s, very mild, and a child who's severely affected. So you can have 30 or 40 years gap in age of onset in some ataxias. You don't have this in ARCA1.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Amy?
Yeah, I think that from the other people's questions, my question was answered, but basically I just want to recap the severity of which you have your symptoms. Let's see, your brain determines that, your body determines that, not the repeats, correct?
Okay, so the repeats are in the SCAs. They're not in ARCA1. In ARCA1, you don't have the repeats, you have a point mutation. So in the scars, the repeats determine the severity of your symptoms. In ARCA1, it's not a repeat disease. So it's a mutation that you have that allows you to diagnose the disease. But the difference between one patient and another is not based on which mutation you have. It's based on your ability to compensate for the disability. But
Okay.
it's not the gene that will give you the effect. It's really your own genetic makeup.
All right, thank you, yeah.
Jesse?
Just to answer my question.
Oh, okay.
I don't have to repeats.
Well, I had does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah.
Oh, Maria?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I don't know which one I've got. It's so rare. It's not even in the common in the common ataxias, and it is quite. They tell me it's quite extensive to go looking for it. So I'm kind of like almost a bit lost with how to even die. Just to just to explain the symptoms, because it's just so unknown.
Yes, you mean it's difficult for you to explain what you have, right? To explain it to people because it's
original.
Yes.
Sorry, go
Yes,
on.
people who have a cancer, you know, they have someone that they know that they can relate to. But in these diseases, they're very rare, and I agree that people are not familiar with any of it, and so it's hard to explain. It's hard to. Yeah, I have seen this in a lot of my patients, and often they feel that, you know, they're a bit, you know, their employer doesn't understand, their spouse doesn't understand. Yeah, it's tough.
One question. Oh, sorry, Courtney.
I have a question. Okay. So thank you for all the information. Do you have any younger patients?
Yes, I would say my young patients are maybe in their 20s. I don't do pediatric neurology, so but it's rare that it starts before 20 years old. I would say it does sometimes, but you know, the symptoms are more minute you know, before. I think the earliest age of onset we've seen was 16, or it was about patient recall. So,
Right.
so I do have some in their 20s, but it's rare.
And what commonalities do you see over time with your younger patients?
Commonalities. Hmm.
or outcome, I guess?
Yes, okay, you mean the outcome. Well, it's, I mean, all the neurodegenerative disease, the age of onset certainly has something to do with the severity or with the long-term disability. So that's one aspect. But often, the patients that I studied, 20 years ago and 15 years ago that we described in the initial cohort, they were patients from another generation. People today are more active, they're more healthy. And so my assessment of the prognosis has changed, I would say, over the past decade. I had a patient in her 30s who was close to be wheelchair bound, and mainly because she was overweight and very sedentary, and so. And I spoke with a colleague of mine who does bariatric surgery. And so she underwent a gastric bypass. And after that, she regained a lot of her function just by losing weight and going back to doing exercise. And so I find that people who are engaged in their physical condition, who maintain a very healthy quality of life and healthy food and all these things, I find that their disability is different. And so I think that's important to consider. My opinion of this has changed over the last decade. I was more concerned about my younger patients before than now, because I find that they do a lot more to maintain their physical function.
Right.
There was one question that I thought of. Now, when it comes to testing for a disease, right? I'm told that the person ordering the test kind of has to have a hunch about what it might be, right? Because you don't want to go testing for a lot of ataxias. Is going to get expensive, right?
Well, up to I would say 5 years ago, that was an issue, but right now, testing for 300 diseases is about the same as testing for one.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so the panels right now are cheap enough that you can order them by just knowing the disease category. What's more tricky, however, is if you do 300 tests, the likelihood of finding something is high. And so there you have to go back to your book and say, well, they're describing a variant. They're not sure if it's a mutation or not. They're describing this in a disease which I don't know, which I haven't seen before. And it's a disease that affects the nerve, but my patients don't have a nerve impact. So you have to be careful now in the readings that you do of your genetic tests, because sometimes if you don't know the disease well, they're not always reliable. I would say they're 95% reliable, but there's a 5% margin that you have to be careful with.
And sorry, John, I'll get to you in a second. In your experience, are there a handful of testing facilities that you would recommend people go to if they're getting tested?
All the major academic centers in North America, they will have neurologists or teams of neurologists that will split the syndromes, in terms of their subspecialty. And, I would say that most general neurologists, when they see an ataxia case, they can, they can order a very wide test, genomic test that will be quite reliable. So in terms of their expertise on the disease, well, that's different. But, I get emails and calls sometimes about people who haven't seen the disease before and they wonder what to tell their patient. I get, people asking me about confirmations of different mutations that are tricky or so. It's, you know, we tend to share expertise on these diseases, but the big commercial labs in the US, most of them are quite reliable, and there are no commercial labs in Canada for the ataxia. So the test, we order it from a university of, no, we order it, it's a private company, it's called Prevention Genetics, but it's one of many that offer the test.
Okay. And John had a question. Before we get to that, though, I don't want to take up too much of Nicolas's time. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll quickly get to it. But John, go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Dupré, throughout the day, your brain compensates for various movements. So toward even one gets very fatigued. This just happens, right?
Yes, patients who have ataxias, what they often report is that as the day goes by, and if they're tired, really their ability to so what I tell them usually is that they have to focus a lot more on what they're doing. And so they become a bit exhausted after a while. And so they need to adapt their work and even their home environment so that, you know, they need to be allowed more time to perform at the same level. And sometimes they just can't perform at the same level because it's just too much information to integrate at the same time. So yes, there is mental fatigue, and it does impact patients with ataxia very significantly.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for your time, Nicolas. It was certainly informative.
Thank you.
And I guess we'll catch up with you. I'll send you an email with our Facebook group. I don't know if you're on Facebook, but we're trying to spread ataxia awareness as much as we can. So you'd certainly be welcome there. And thanks again for your time.
Well, I thank you, and I'm very moved by this initiative, and I think it's become even more important, you know, over the last year, and I suspect it's going to last a while. So, well, really, these gatherings and community gatherings are important for physical and mental health.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.